Hello all. So far we have covered all the NgRx topics that every Angular developer should know, except for NgRx effects. So if you go back to the NgRx pattern, we have understood the left portion of this diagram, which includes creating action, building reducers, using the store, and utilizing selectors in components. And this covers the core concepts of NgRx. Now we will shift our focus to the right side of the NgRx pattern, which is effects. And effects handles complex actions such as interacting with backend APIs through services. And a backend API enables communication between our application and a server. So to understand the NgRx effects concept thoroughly, we will build a complete CRUD application, create, read, update, delete using a JSON server. And this hands-on approach will help us to understand the full functionality of creating, reading, updating, and deleting entries. So in this section, we will implement routing and then set up a JSON server to build the fundamental for our CRUD application. So let me jump into the Visual Studio Code editor and now we'll start from here. And one more thing, since we have covered these routing implementation and set up a JSON server in our Angular 19 series, I will quickly recap routing and JSON server here. But if you are new to Angular, I highly recommend checking out my comprehensive Angular 19 tutorial where I explain each concept in detail. So let's start. In our previous project, to avoid confusion, I have created a components folder and moved all components inside it. So now all components are organized within components folder. And while NGRX related files like actions, reducers, and store are allocated in the state folder. Under this state folder, I have created two folders, counter and EMP. Inside counter folder, you can find all the counter related action reducer and store files. And inside EMP folder, you can find all the employee related reducer and store files. Okay. Now next, since Angular is a component based application, we will implement routing first, which will enable navigation between components. And after setting up routing, we will create a new JSON server from scratch to build CRUD operations. And I'll start design our page with a sample navbar at the top, featuring links to our counter example and CRUD operation. And to achieve this, we will create a new component called navbar. NgGenerate component name navbar. And I'll add the selector of this navbar component inside app.component.html file at the top. And also I need to import the same component inside imports array of the app component class file. So here I'll import navbar component. Now save the changes, and if I open the browser, here you can see the navbar component is rendered in the browser. And since we have already installed Bootstrap, we will use a Bootstrap navbar. So here I'll search Bootstrap navbar and I'll click on this version 5.3, and then I'll copy this first example and paste it into our navbar component.html file. Okay. Then I'll make some modifications as per our need. I'll remove this selector, and then instead of navbar here I'll write NgRx. I'll remove this href hash. After that, I'll delete this drop down. Also, I'll delete this disable button and I'll delete this form. And now here I'll update this link with name counter and the second link with CRUD. Now save the changes and have a look into the browser. Okay. I'll update the background color to secondary. And now it looks like a navbar. Now next I'll create a new component for a counter functionality, ngGenerate counter, and I'll move the counter related code from the app component to the counter component along with necessary imports. Okay, let me correct the command. I missed C for component. Okay, and then I'll go inside the app component.html file and accept this app navbar selector. I'll cut the code from here and paste it inside the counter component. Similarly, I'll copy the class related code from this app component.ts file, cut, then inside counter class file, I'll paste. Also, I need to import all missing imports. So I'll click on add all missing imports, and then I'll again go back to the app component class file, and I'll cut the component from this imports array except Navbar component. Paste all these components inside the imports array of counter component with the import statements. And now I'll add the counter component selector inside this app component. And if I save the changes, you can see, okay, I need to import the counter component inside the imports array. Okay, now save the changes. And if I refresh the page, you can see the navbar, and below navbar, we can see the counter component. I'll change the heading counter example. Okay. So like this, we have created two separate component, navbar and counter, and added these two components inside the app component.html file. But in future, we will create additional components for CRUD operations. So instead of adding all these components to this app.component.html file, we will implement route. So this will allow us to use the router outlet directive, which will render the components dynamically based on the route. And when creating our project, we opted for routing, which generated the app.routes.ts file. And this file contains an empty array of type routes. So let's configure the routes here. A route is an object that consists of two parameters. The first parameter is a path, and the second parameter is a component. So this first path parameter, which is a URL path for your component, it can be any name. For example, I'll write counter for our counter component, which we need to provide inside the single quotes. Okay. And the second parameter is component, which specifies which component to render when this path is accessed. So here we need to provide the component class name. So for the path counter, I will provide the counter component. Okay. So what is route? A route is an object, and within that object, we have two parameters, path and component. The path refers to the link for your component, and component parameter specifies which component to render when this path is accessed. So in this case, when a user accesses the counter path, it means they want to be redirected to the counter component. Therefore, in the same way, we can add multiple route objects as needed, separated by comma. So I'll add one more route for CRUD operation. So path will be CRUD and component will be CRUD component. Okay. Before that, I need to create one more component called CRUD component. NgGenerate component CRUD, and CRUD component has been created. Now I can import this CRUD component here. Okay, so this is how we have added two routes inside this routes array. Also, I'll add a default route that will render when we load the application. And for the default route, the path will be empty and the component will be the one on which you wish to render your application. And since we are continuing working with CRUD operation, I wish to render my application on CRUD component. So here I'll provide CRUD component, but you can provide a login or dashboard component as per the requirement. So this is how we can configure the routes in Angular application. And now the important step is we need to add the router outlet directive where the router will render the component associated with the current route. So I'll add the router outlet directive below the navbar component selector because we need the navbar on every page. And it's mandatory to import the router outlet inside the imports array of same component. So here I'll import the router outlet. And now I can delete this app counter selector from here because we have already added the route for counter inside the app.routes.ts file. Okay. Now when I refresh the browser, you can see our application is by default rendered on CRUD component. Because in the default route, we have provided the component name CRUD component. But here, if I type counter and hit enter, it renders the counter component along with the navbar. And similarly, if I type CRUD, it renders the CRUD component. And this demonstrates routing between component via URL. However, For easy access, we want to achieve the same redirection when a navbar link is clicked. And if I open the navbar component HTML file, we can see currently navbar template uses the href attribute, which causes a full page reload for every redirection. And it's not ideal for an Angular application, as it's designed for building single page application that dynamically update content without full page reload. So to do this, we will use a router link directive instead of this href, because router link directive enables seamless navigation between components without page reload. So let's use the router link directive with a lowercase r and an uppercase L. Router link equals to, here we will provide the same path of the respective component that we configured in the routes array here. And as we have learned in the Angular 19 series, there are 4 ways to use the router link directive. First way is like this: inside double quotes, we can pass the route path. And the second way is we can use path name with forward slash like this. And third, we can use property binding where we bind the path name as a string like this. So we need to wrap this router link inside square bracket and this counter path inside single quote. This is the third way. And the fourth way is we can wrap this counter inside square bracket so that it allows us to add the ID, name, or status in future separated by comma. Okay. So by using this router link, we will enable seamless navigation between components without page reload. Okay, so I'll copy the same router link directive from here and paste it for the CRUD operation as well. And for CRUD component, we need to provide the path CRUD. Okay, now save the changes and okay, one more thing. Before we test this in the browser, we need to import this router link into the imports array. So let me go inside the class file and import router link. Now save the changes and now we can test. Now I'll click on this counter link and we can smoothly render this counter component. If I click on the CRUD, we can render on the CRUD component without page reload. And notice that the URL changes without page reload when I click on the counter component. I'm redirecting to the counter component seamlessly. Similarly, clicking on the other links doesn't trigger a page refresh, indicating that our router link directive is working correctly. And one more thing, to highlight the active link on the navbar, we can use router link active directive. And this directive dynamically adds CSS classes to an element when its link route is active. And to do this, we need to first import the router link active directive inside the imports array. And then in the HTML file, we will assign the active class to the directive using router link active directive. So here I'll write router link active equals to, I'll assign the class active. Same I'll paste for CRUD component. And now this will apply the styles defined in the active class when the corresponding route is active. So let's quickly add CSS for this active class. Let me go inside the CSS file of this navbar component to define the appearance of the active link. So here I'll write active and inside this active class I'll provide font weight bold and font style equals to italic. Okay, save the changes. And if I revisit the browser, we can see by default we land on the CRUD component. That is why we can see this CRUD in bold. Now if I navigate to the counter component, then this counter component is in bold. So by doing this, user can easily understand currently he is under which component. Okay. And with this, we have successfully implemented routing through URL as well as link clicks without page reload. Okay. Now, next thing we need for our CRUD operation is setting up a JSON server. But for CRUD operation, we could use a dummy API like JSON placeholder. If we go inside this first link, so we can work with this API user to do photo album, etc. However, since we want to perform all CRUD operations, I'll choose a JSON server for this purpose. And with JSON server, we can create our own API and update the data as needed, making it easier to understand the process. So let's set up our JSON server with a similar data to this to-dos API. like user ID, title, and completed. Okay. So first, let's understand what steps are required in order to set up the JSON server. And this process involves three steps. First step is we will install JSON server using the command npm install -g JSON server @0. And this @0 flag ensures that we install the stable version, which automatically generates IDs in integer format when adding new data to the database. Second, we will create a JSON file, that is db.json, to serve as the data source. And third step is we will run the JSON server using command JSON-server --watch JSON file name. In this case, db.json. And by following these three steps, we can set up the JSON server and create a mock backend API. Now let's do it practically. Let me go back to Visual Studio Code Editor, and here I'll open a new terminal. And as per the first step, let's run the command npm install -g JSON-server @0. And note that installing without @0 flag might generate ID in hexadecimal format instead of integers. And we are installing JSON server globally. If you have already installed it, you can check the version using command JSON-server -v. And if not, simply run this command npm install -g JSON-server @0. Now next, in the second step, we will create a new file with .json extension at root level. And here I'll create a new file called db.json. Let me move this file outside to this src folder. And now we will add a sample data to this file, including an array called to-dos with individual to-do objects. Okay, let me copy the object from this to-do API, user ID, title, and completed. And now I'll update this object with title NgRx Tutorial with ID 1. Now I'll add few more objects here. So I'll copy the same object and paste it for 3 more times. I'll update the ID with 2 and title will be Angular tutorial. I'll update with RxJS. Fourth, I'll update with TypeScript. Okay. So with this, we have completed our first two steps, that is installation of JSON server and created the db.json file with dummy data. Now let's go ahead with the third step, that is running the JSON server. So let me open the terminal again. Let me clear this console. And now to start the JSON server, we need to use the command JSON-server --watch and file name, that is db.json, and hit enter. And this will start the JSON server and provide us with API endpoints, such as this HTTP localhost :3000/2dos. And notice that the endpoint includes the name of the array we created in the db.json file, which is to-dos. And navigating to this URL in our browser, it displays the data we added to the db.json file. And this confirms that we set up our JSON server with the functional API endpoint and data, effectively creating a mock backend API. And this approach is perfect for practicing CRUD operations without relying on a real API. Okay, so with this, we have completed the routing implementation as well as configured a JSON server, effectively preparing a base for CRUD operations. And in the next video, we will dive into implementing CRUD operations one by one using NgRx. So stay tuned by subscribing to FED Learning and show your support by liking, commenting, and sharing my videos with your friends. Thank you. Bye-bye.